Yeah, my name is Joe Nocera. I'm a columnist with the New York Times. I am sitting here with Marvin Odum, the president of Shell Oil, who I'm so happy to see has a very short bio. You don't see that very often these days. He earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from University of Texas, a master's from business administration at the University of Houston, and he's been at Shell since 1982, when he began as an engineer. And he's done all that good guy stuff that people do in Houston, Texas. Trust me. First of all, we will have plenty of time for questions. Even I don't have an hour's worth of questions about hydraulic fracking, although I will try. I hadn't realized that the Aspen Institute had become like the Paris Air Show. The air show, they wait till the Boeing and Airbus, they always wait till they get to the show to make these big announcements about plane sales, so they can get maximum benefit. And it turns out that Marvin and Shell made an announcement yesterday about the principles that were going to guide their natural gas drilling and so on. So I'm going to just start by asking Marvin to describe them in very short. This is going to be this is where he gets his advertisement right now, right here. And then we will get into some meaty questions about the future of natural gas, the future of natural gas drilling in the United States, and the potential risks and problems they all pose. So let's just begin, Marvin, by very quickly outlining, what Shell has announced, and also why you felt the need to put out a statement saying we're not going to kill anybody when we drill for natural gas.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Joe. So let's start there. The idea of releasing this at this event came up about 2.5 months ago or so. Shell comes here every year. We love participating in this event. And with the backdrop of everything that's been happening around natural gas, a lot of very negative information out there around environmental impacts and so forth, we felt like it was important to be very transparent, make a very public statement about how do you do this business the right way. And we felt like the best way to do that was to break it down into some key principles and have that run down into a cascading level of detail all the way to very specifically how you operate in all the important aspects of developing natural gas. And we just set a milestone. I set a milestone, actually, to just say, when we're in Aspen in June, let's make the announcement there. And the reason I picked that, this is a great event, but the reason I picked that is you have to have some deadline to get something done, especially in a big company like this, because there's a lot of people to get on board. And we got there. And so we rolled out these principles, and these principles very quickly, without going into the detail, are, first of all, in the safety area. This is all about how do you keep people safe, and how do you drill a well that has real integrity. And for those of you that want to talk a lot about hydraulic fracturing and the dangers there, the real issue is around well integrity, drilling a well that can contain fluids, contain pressures, and won't leak now or in the future. So we should come back to that one. The second principle is around how do you protect air. And so it has to do with the equipment you use, how you minimize emissions from that equipment, and how you very specifically, if you think about some of the information that's come out recently, how do you prevent fugitive emissions, methane leaking into the air, which is a very important issue. The third area is protecting water, surface water, groundwater, and how you dispose of any produced fluids, what you do with those fluids that come out of a well, because they have compounds in it that you don't want getting into the water system. So a whole set of how we do that. The fourth element is around the footprint. So it's how do you minimize your physical footprint on the surface? How do you work with local communities and groups to identify the best way to do this? And then some very specific techniques and improving techniques on how you clearly minimize that footprint. And when I say footprint, I mean everything from land disturbance through how many trucks are driving through the area. And then the last piece is around engagement with primarily communities, I'd say, but I also include in this group the regulators and NGOs, civil society, how we propose that we should all work together to do this the right way. And from a community standpoint, that has everything to do with what I call local content, or developing businesses and getting the economic benefits in those communities when you go in and develop a resource like this.
All right. So the first question that I would ask about this, which is a really it's hard to disagree with anything here, is you're one company, and it's true that you may do everything by the book and everything by these standards, but my understanding is that part of the problem with hydraulic fracturing and with well integrity, especially in Pennsylvania, where people are complaining about it vociferously, is there are a lot of sort of fly-by-night is too strong a word, but a lot of operators who are much smaller, who don't feel like they have the money to be able to do this, and the well casing issue in particular is a problem, and so it's sort of like saying, well, we're going to build our wells offshore with integrity, but if BP has one that blows up, there's nothing we can do about that. So, I mean, how do you respond to that and to the notion that maybe this stuff needs to be, maybe these principles ought to be turned into some sort of regulation?
So I think I'll pick up right where you left off. The fact, when you look back at what happened in the Gulf of Mexico last year, that had a lot to do with why I'm approaching this the way I am here and the way we are as a company. And that is, I think that it's, rather than work behind the scenes for 2 years with other companies, with regulators, to try to come out with one program that solves all of these problems for the whole industry, we decided that the best way to do it is, we think we know how to do this right. We can protect all the elements that we've talked about. Let's put these out into the public and be very public about it. That's not to say, and it shouldn't stop at, here's a company that thinks they can do this the right way. Our motive in this is absolutely to influence regulators and to influence other companies. Because the simple fact is that we as an operator in the Marcellus Shale or anywhere else, any other aspect of our business actually, we're only as good as the worst operator in the area, because they have a huge impact on what happens to us and whether or not we're able to develop. So what I want, through putting these out into the public and getting this conversation going and being transparent not only about what we think the rules should be, but how they should be monitored and measured, I want to see that in regulation, and I want to see that regulation enforced.
Would you, one of the things that's always been true about drilling for gas in the United States, it's been regulated by states. And so you've got a situation where, for instance, in New York, there is a moratorium right now on hydraulic fracturing and about drilling for gas because they don't feel confident that they're trying to make sure that they have the appropriate regulations. In Pennsylvania, you have a situation where the environmental department believes that it is regulating appropriately, but there are many people in Pennsylvania around the areas where drilling is going on who believe that their land is being despoiled and they're worried about their water and so on and so forth. You have situations in Fort Worth where basically sort of anything goes. That's a little unfair, but
yeah, that's probably not right.
So my question is, would we be better served as a country if this was taken out of the domain of the states and if natural gas drilling was in the purview of the United States, of the federal government?
So when I first started to engage in this argument, I have to say I came into it sort of, I'm not sure I really care either way as long as there's a strong set of regulations. Having dug into it, having worked with the states, having worked very closely with a state like Wyoming, who's been doing this for quite a while, who does it extremely well, who has a system that can be replicated in other states, and coming to the realization, I think, that the local geology, the local topography, the local communities, so many of the local aspects have a lot to do with how this should get done in those areas. I think, as long as the state has time to get those regulations in place and do it right, my bias is towards the states at this point. But we ought to recognize that there's an overlapping set of regulations here. So there's a lot of this that's done at the state level, but having some overarching regulations at a federal level is perfectly fine as well, as far as I'm concerned. But I think you will have trouble trying to pull this away from the states. And I think there's plenty of good examples out there of how states can do this very well and may actually be in a better position to do it.
Well, could you give us a couple of examples of what specifically Wyoming does that other states would be well advised to follow?
Yeah, I think Wyoming, at least, as I think back on the last couple of years and how these have developed, very specific to the wildlife issues and the migration of wildlife across their plains. They've been working in this space for 200 years and understanding that. And so how the footprint side of this, where you drill wells, how close they are together, not to have habitat fragmentation and so forth, the state's in the perfect position to regulate that. Understanding the water issues and the water issues as they impact ranchers and residents and so forth is extremely important. Understanding, again, the geology and how the geology reacts to this and the topography reacts to this kind of activity is critical. And then I think ultimately it's knowing the people and what the communities want. Those are some, but there's a lot more examples.
So let's just get right down to it. Is fracking dangerous?
Fracking itself, so my answer is no. But there's so much to answering that question that I think we're going to need to take some time to get into some of these aspects. So the idea, let me just start here. Hopefully most of the audience knows pretty much what we're talking about, but the idea of drilling a well, if you have a water table that you really absolutely need to protect that's, say, 1,000 feet or so below the surface, maybe more, maybe less, depending on where you are, but you drill down another mile or more into a gas-containing zone. We drill a horizontal well through that gas-containing zone, and then we do multiple fracture treatments in that well. Now, those fracture treatments include pumping fluid, sand, and a small degree of chemicals. So just to give you a breakdown, 99% of what gets pumped into the well is sand and water, and about 1% are gels, gums to give it some consistency to lower friction, some chemicals like ethylene glycol, like antifreeze, things like that. So there's about 1% of various chemicals that are in this compound. That gets pumped into the formation, cracks it open, keeps it open with the sand. That's what the sand is for, and that allows the gas to flow. Those fractures, if you look at the scale of the surface and the surface water and all the layers of geology down to where you're creating that fracture, it's an incredibly small area over a huge scale. And so when I say it's not dangerous, the first part of that I'm talking about is the risk of a fracture going into a zone where you don't want it to be, into a freshwater zone or some other area you want to protect. From my mind, as an engineer and spending a lot of time in geology, it's impossible. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't make that happen. I'll stop there on that piece. The biggest concern around hydraulic fracturing, is not the actual cracking of the rock and what you're putting in the well. The concern is you've drilled a well now through a freshwater zone into a gas-bearing zone, and you've effectively now connected the two. And so you put a straw between the two where there was no connection before. And so isolating that water zone through multiple layers of pipe and multiple layers of mechanical seals and cement is the critical part of protecting water, because it's not just hydraulic fracturing fluids we want to keep out of those water zones. You don't want anything coming from this gas-bearing zone and hydrocarbon-bearing zone getting into that water either. So you have to drill the well properly. It has to be monitored properly over time. And if you do that correctly, then it's safe. That's why, these principles, that's why an insistence that there be very strong regulations around this, and the regulators be sufficiently resourced, both in money and in people and training and skills, to enforce those regulations.
It's easy to see why people would find this scary and troubling. You've got the environmental impact, and you've got the fear that something could leach into the water supply. And I think it's exacerbated by the fact that we live in a time when states are broke, basically. They don't have a lot of money, and there's a lot of worry that regulatory bodies at the state level will be cut back and will not have the wherewithal to do the kind of monitoring that you're talking about. And I do think it gets back to the idea of your shell, you're going to do this right, you're going to spend what it takes, but how do I know that the other 90% of the guys doing this are going to do the same thing?
Well, I think you make them do it the right way, and that's part of what this is all about for me. I think the idea of kind of a state or a federal regulator be sufficiently resourced, while it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, I think there's a correlation between developing these type of resources and funding that agency that certainly work together. I mean, if you look at energy development in the U.S., I mean, it is the second largest flow of revenue to the federal government. It comes from the royalties from oil and gas production. There is a tremendous amount of money that flows to the states associated with developing these resources. And funneling the appropriate amount of that money into building the right type of regulator, I think, should be part of the state's program.
I'm guessing that there are audience members here who are going to want to ask their own questions about fracking and their problems. I know there's one person here I sat next to at dinner who gave me an earful about this last night, so I'm certainly hoping that he's here. But I want to just sort of switch gears for a little bit and talk about, one of the things Shell has done, according to the information that I got from you guys, is you now drill more for natural gas than you do for oil. Is that more?
Yeah, I think a better way to state it is if you look at our business on a global basis, as one of the largest companies in the world, by 2012 we'll actually produce more gas than oil, and that's not by accident. Huh?
Okay,
yeah.
And so what is the potential for natural gas to, replace, for instance, America's dependence on foreign oil? I mean, what are the prospects for natural gas as you look out over the horizon as potentially a bridge fuel to an electric car, for instance?
Yeah, I think it's not understated to say, or overstated to say, that this is an unbelievable. I called it a gift once when I was interviewed recently, but a resource has been given to this country and certainly to North America, and if you want, we can talk about where it's starting to happen internationally as well. But a resource that now can provide a huge amount of the energy that we need for over 100 years at today's type of consumption level. And I think if you compare where we were as a country a couple of years ago, where we were running out of natural gas, we already imported 60% of the oil that we use. We were looking at having to start importing most of the gas, or a lot of the gas that we use, while we try to develop alternative renewable energies and so forth. That was a real energy problem for this country that I don't think was sufficiently recognized, which in my mind means the benefit that we're seeing now from the natural gas may not be sufficiently realized. But in terms of the security of supply for energy, that's a pretty obvious one. You can see if you produce it at home, you're not depending on other countries to give it to you. That's a pretty strong incentive. The economics associated with developing that here, the jobs that it creates, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, ultimately the million jobs that it could create, developing this resource here, real economic benefit locally, solves a lot of economic problems. The trade balance problems that you see. So much of our imbalance of trade is because we're sending all our dollars overseas to import energy to the U.S. It helps solve that problem. And I mentioned the royalties from gas earlier as they flow into the federal government. So you get a resource that's secure, developed here, creates jobs, helps the economy, and on top of all that provides another revenue source into the Treasury, a Treasury that absolutely needs that revenue source. And then just to finish off, Joe, I think to the idea of replacing imported oil and so forth, where we're moving now with natural gas is how do you get that into transportation? And clearly electrification is part of the answer there. But the other element is how do you take natural gas and from an efficiency standpoint take it directly into transportation? And compressed natural gas, people know about it. It's been out there for years, and it's used sporadically in other places of the world more so than here. But the technology I think we're most excited about is the idea of liquefied natural gas, which is then a denser energy source, and moving liquefied natural gas into heavy transport, so trucks, marine transport, trains. So
you're in favor of the Boone-Pickens bill?
Well, there's a whole lot of that bill that I'm absolutely in favor of.
And just so people know, it's a bill that would encourage 18-wheelers, which fundamentally can never really be electrified because they're too heavy. It's a way to encourage them to start building new 18-wheelers that are fueled by natural gas instead of oil. The great irony, of course, is it's run into tremendous resistance in the Congress because it's being fought by the Koch brothers, who have ethanol and oil interests So the environmentalists and the anti-fracturing people are not the people beating this back. It is the oil people who are beating it back, just in case you're wondering.
Some of the oil people.
Some of the oil people.
There's taking liquefied natural gas into heavy transport. I think you may have written about this, Joe. Heavy transport represents something like a quarter of all the oil that we import and use in transportation. So this is a big part of the market. If you could affect that piece of the market, that makes a real difference.
Does Shell view itself as an energy company or an oil and gas company? And the reason I ask that is because, to what extent are you looking into other forms of cleaner energy, such as solar, such as wind, such as, battery, for that matter?
Yeah.
Or do you view yourselves as people who really do a good job of extracting fossil fuels from the earth?
Yeah. I'm going to add one piece to the last one and then go directly to that. I think because there's another technology out there that's being proven as we speak, and it's called gas to liquid. So it's the permanent conversion of natural gas into a liquid fuel like a gasoline or like a diesel. And then you can distribute it, use it exactly like you do liquid fuels, but it comes from the cleaner, value chain, if you will, of natural gas. And we're just starting up a plant, $20 billion plant basically in Qatar that's just in the last couple of weeks started to produce and deliver these liquid now fuels from natural gas to Europe. So that's another opportunity for North America and for the U.S. is to convert some of that gas. There's no question that Shell is an energy company. And one of these days, I've got to do something about the legal name that we have for the name here, which is Shell Oil Company, because I already said we're producing more oil than gas, and we do a tremendous amount of research and real investment into alternative forms of energy. And I can tell you that I just got back from a week in China with our board, working on what is the energy picture. We think about this all the time, by the way. Wasn't just 1 week in China, but what is this energy picture going to look like in 2025, 2030, and 2050? And I think you probably know that Shell routinely puts out what we call scenarios around where the energy future is going to try to build this wide band of understanding. It's not just information from us. We go out and gather information from experts all over the world and other types of energy to say, in a world in 2050, which is where these scenarios go to, and where we have to think as a company because our investments will last for decades. Just think for a second about what's going to happen to the world by the middle of this century. If we continued on the path we're on today in terms of how energy is used, we'll need 3 times as much energy in 2050 as we needed in 2000. So you think we have issues now, multiplied demand for energy by 3. And as we build these scenarios, we think if you take dramatic, and I mean dramatic, you've never seen them in history before, like what you'd have to see in the future, dramatic changes in efficiency, dramatic changes in the acceleration of alternative fuels from wind to solar, including nuclear, and hydrogen, and ultimately to fuel cells and so forth, that unprecedented ever in the history of the world growth of those resources means that in a world that's using twice as much energy in 2050, that could potentially fill 30% of that space. It still leaves 60 to 70% of that space for something else. So we have real energy issues going forward. So finding ways to develop those other energies very quickly to fill the space and to figure out a way to continue to do these hydrocarbons cleaner and better all the time is a must.
I've just been informed that we have 20 minutes left, so I was going to ask you about the economics, but I think it's more important to get to questions. So, do we have questions? Surely we do.
Lots.
Go ahead, sir.
Excuse me. Mr. Odum, you said that natural gas is an unbelievable gift and a great resource for America. Mr. Nocera's New York Times had a headline on Sunday, "Insiders sound alarm amid a national gas rush." And then with another follow-up article on Monday, "Behind veneer, doubt on future of natural gas." The articles were, not only in my opinion, but the opinion of many others, poorly documented, a totally freighted opinion, with the flimsiest of attributions, And I really would like to get maybe Mr. Nocera's comments on this and your reaction to the coverage that the New York Times has given this issue.
You want my reaction? I work for the New York Times. The notion that I'm going to sit here and criticize reporting in the New York Times is a little far-fetched. I'm an op-ed columnist for the Times. I have taken the position in several columns that I agree that natural gas is a gift. And I just say, for the record, the response I got from readers was furious, absolutely furious. People are very worried about the potential dangers to their water in the Marcellus Shale, which is under New York, and so on and so forth.
This was about supply. This was not about fracking. This was simply about the availability of natural gas. There was no mention of fracking.
The articles, just for the record, and I'm going to ask Marvin to respond to it, not me. They basically they questioned whether the economics were really appropriate. They questioned whether there was really as much gas, whether the wells were running out a lot faster than people thought. And they just basically questioned whether the boom was as real as it has been portrayed. And so I think I'm sure you read those stories.
I did.
And I
read
it's
all the articles.
Responding to them.
If you'll let me approach it from a Shell point of view first, and then we'll translate that to the rest of the industry. So we have taken over the last 6 years big positions in these major tight gas, shale gas basins across North America. What that means is we have, at least now, between 3 and 4 million acres. We have what we think are over 40 trillion cubic feet of resources that will be developed and produced ultimately. And to a basin, our experience so far has been, this was exploration on the front end. Our experience has been that these wells are producing and the resource is proving itself to be as good or better than all of our expectations going in. So think of Shell as a company where we invest about $30 billion a year around the world, and we can move that money to the best projects anywhere in the world. And in 2011, we'll invest between $3 and $4 billion just drilling natural gas wells in North America. And if gas prices were a little bit stronger than they are now, I could be spending on this exact same portfolio $6 billion a year drilling natural gas wells. Now, I wouldn't be doing that if that wasn't a real, a profitable, a viable resource for us as a company and all that means in terms of supply. Now, and I think a lot of that can be translated back to the others in the industry. So given that we're in most of the big shale basins, that would be my answer.
Yes, sir. You had your hand up last time, too.
Good morning. I'm Mike Pack. I have a question on the Boone-Pickens legislation. Why wouldn't UPS and FedEx and these other major trucking companies already be turning over to converting their vehicles to natural gas? Does that require all new engines, or can they retrofit the existing engines?
You can do some retrofit. So it depends on how far you want to go, and the cost will change as the technology changes a bit. But you can retrofit to a large degree, and I think you actually will start to see some of those fleets go now. There's two dynamics. One is the technology is better, and the other is this differential between where oil prices are and because we've found so much gas, where gas prices are, that on an energy equivalent basis, gas is much, much less than half the cost of oil. Sometimes it's 25% the cost of oil, depending on how the daily prices are running. And so you can see there's a lot of incentives there. So there will be a pull from these heavy transport users to use some of that. We're actually pushing it from the perspective of Shell as well, because we think this is a very good, viable use for this natural gas. So we're working on a project now, which, because of some confidentiality issues with partners, I can't say too much about it. But what we're doing is we're finding these very large, long corridors of very heavy industrial traffic. Think of the major trucking routes and so forth. And we're going to build these, or have built these fueling stations so that these trucks can convert. They run very predictable routes. They can always fill up and know it's going to be there, and then get all the benefits of using this transportation fuel. So you will see that start to happen now.
When you're talking about hydraulic fracturing, you're primarily focusing around the natural gas aspects. But Could you talk a little bit about what's going on with hydraulic fracturing as it relates to liquids and oil, in fact? And are we in the beginning of what could be also a significant internal growth of oil production, as odd as that may sound?
Yeah, I think I was never one to use the term energy independence because I never believed that was rational or possible. And nor do I still use it in exactly that way, but you touch on something. We've seen the significant change in natural gas resources in the U.S. What happens is in some of these same reservoirs, as you move through the geology, there are areas that might be shallower or deeper that have had a different pressure and temperature environment over the millions of years that it took to create the oil and gas. And some of these zones actually have light oil in them as opposed to this natural gas we've been talking about. And what we're finding, what the industry is finding now, is this same fracture treating in these same reservoirs. You can produce quite a bit of oil. So the Bakken area up in the Dakotas is up to the hundreds of thousands of barrels, almost 500,000 barrels a day, I think now, in terms of this light oil production. So you're absolutely right. That is potentially now has to be proven. I think to the point of the earlier question, you don't hear us and too many other companies saying this is going to be a huge bonanza, going to eliminate oil imports to the U.S. because it's too early to say that. But it is very interesting and it is exciting. And you're seeing, because the natural gas prices are so low, you're seeing quite a bit of the drilling shift to this heavier liquid side and the oil side. So the U.S. is going through an energy shift that potentially changes the whole economic picture.
Jeff.
Thanks, Joe. Nice to meet you. I'm Jeff Weiss. We're both in the energy business. I'm in the solar energy business. So in the grand scheme of things, and I'm happy to hear you're in the energy business broadly, and most of your footprint is in that which the sun created over the last few million years. I'm in that which the sun is creating this year and in the coming years. So we're coming together in the value chain. Our perspective comes out from economics. So as we invest, as you say, as you invest, you have to invest to get a return on investment to your investors. We spend a lot of time looking at both the levelized cost of energy and the levelized profit of energy, and I'll share a white paper we're about to produce showing that solar has a very low, if not the lowest, levelized profit of energy in the current environment. We're having the opportunity to invest in the part of the value chain where the cost is coming down by 50% a year. My question is, in the natural gas side of the business, and given your comments on fracking, and I'm very happy with the 5 points that you put out, what's going to happen to the cost of natural gas so that you will realize at the market the full market price of extracting it correctly? So if we suspend disbelief, and if one assumes, as I do, that it's possible, I would stipulate it's possible for Shell to frack well correctly. It's probably likely that the other 99% won't. And as you point out, if there's one problem, it's your problem, even if you didn't create it. So a market mechanism has to be created. It probably won't happen at the state regulatory level because they're out of money, out of people, and out of time. What's going to equilibrate that? And will it be a pricing mechanism, and how will that happen?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. I think first of all, I think your assumption that one company may do it right and 99% won't is fundamentally just wrong. It's not true. It's not my experience. I think your assumption that the states can't do this right because of a financial shortage is wrong. We're seeing states do it correctly, and we're just seeing states work very, very hard, including the state of Pennsylvania, to get these regulations where they want them to be, where they think they need to be, where we're advising they should be, and I think putting good enforcement mechanisms in place. So they need some time to adjust. There's no question about that, but I disagree with some of your fundamental assessments.
But the cost,
yeah,
is the price of natural gas too low to make it economically profitable for the middle and small guy to build the kind of wells that need to be built?
In some cases, it may be because so we find a way to do it. We can do it the right way economically. This is the same discussion we had in the deep water for the Gulf of Mexico, and now you've seen the regulations move to a place that basically look like the standards where we were drilling wells before this disaster happened out there. I think the same thing just needs to happen without the disaster in natural gas. So that's what we're talking about. If you can't afford to do it and do it right, then you get run out of the business. I think that's just the way it has to work. But on the cost element and the relative cost basis, and us being an energy company, I mean, we've been in solar a couple of times. We still have a solar business. You probably are familiar with it. We do it through what we call Showa Shell, which is a Japanese company where we're a partner there. I think the solar field is extremely exciting. I have a large wind business here in the U.S. It's not a very exciting business. It doesn't make very much money. It has lots of problems. It suffers from the government not being very consistent and how they'll support a business like that and so forth. We're very big into biofuels. I'm going to get to the equilibration of kind of value and price here in a second, but we're very big into biofuels. I hate biofuels made from food sources. I think corn-based ethanol is not a good fuel source for all of the reasons that a lot of people talk about. But we look at, and we just started a $12 billion joint venture in Brazil producing biofuels from sugarcane, which is already very viable and works economically without subsidies in Brazil. Can be done in a very sustainable way, doesn't impact clearing additional land or anything like that. So we've gone into that in a very big way, and it's a 90% less CO2 than the equivalent of using oil for transport. To get to the equilibration of price, if the issue is, and I'm assuming your issue is moving to a lower carbon energy mix overall, you have to put a price on carbon. And so we as a company have been saying for, I think, 12 years now, something like that we need a price on carbon. And that will start to shift the energy mix. It also, to be perfectly open here, it will advantage things like natural gas. If you put a price on carbon today, the immediate impact would be is you would start retiring coal plants, and because of the capital cost it takes, because of the dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions and so forth, you would install a lot more natural gas-fired power, as well as more solar, as well as more wind and others. So getting a price on carbon, I don't want to steer this conversation off into is cap and trade better than tax or so forth, but we advocate for and believe we need a price on carbon.
Yes, sir?
Why is it taking so long for garbage trucks and long-distance trucks, but especially garbage trucks, to go to natural gas? The gas is so cheap. Like right here in this valley, we have a lot of wells. We have resource. We're not even drilling any wells. And is this natural gas? Do they have to liquefy it before they put it into a truck? I mean, the technology's been there for a long time.
Yeah, the technology exists today, and I ask the same question of myself all the time, but I think there's a pattern here that we all need to recognize is once we all get convinced it's the right thing to do, then we're saying, why isn't it happening already? But if you just think about the last 3 years and natural gas in the U.S. and where it's going, it wasn't that long ago that gas, whereas it might be around $4 to $5 an MCM, 1,000 cubic feet now in terms of price. It wasn't that long ago that it was spiking at $13 and $14 an MCF, and we thought we were running out. So this period of drilling these shale resources over the last 3 years, actually convincing ourselves as the people that are touching it every day, but also the government starting to believe it, industries, power utilities starting to believe it, and then maybe even further down the road, transportation options starting to believe it. That's just now happening. So I think you will start to see cities concerned about their environment start to drive this further, because now there's an economic incentive with the lower price of gas as well. And you get an interesting supply-demand dynamic with natural gas now in North America because there is so much of it. And because it's relative to other energies, it's a relatively fast and smooth ramp-up. If demand was to go up, the drilling would increase and the supply would be there, because these are massive resources where every company is kind of gauging its pace as to how quickly it moves. But you can ramp up very quickly. That's going to have a moderating impact on the volatility of gas price, which makes it much more attractive to utilities, which makes it much more attractive to transportation companies and cities and states and so forth. So that's just now kind of coming into everybody's thinking.
Yes, sir.
Buzz Zano from here in Aspen. Your principles describe a process of creating a responsible well. Is this simply a repeatable process that's available to everyone, or is this unique for each well?
No, it's an absolute repeatable process that I'm happy to give anyone in the business. So there's nothing proprietary about this necessarily. And I'll give you an example. When you move into an area, the first thing that our team will do, and I've got several people on that team here, is they'll go in and they'll test the water. You haven't drilled any gas wells, you haven't done anything, but you test the water, either through landowners' water wells, or if you don't have one, you drill a water well, and you get a baseline test on the water. And then you drill the well, and each step along the way, you're continuing to test the water as a secondary or tertiary test just to make sure there's nothing going wrong. I mean, there's 1,000 elements as you get down into the details of these like that. Anybody can do that. You just have to have the motivation and the capacity as a company to go do it.
Sir?
Thank you, John Dibbs from Palo Alto. Thanks for your leadership on regulation. I think it's absolutely essential. My question is one, given gas is so cheap, as you say, it used to be 6-1, now it's 25-1 oil to gas. What are you budgeting for gas prices in North America over the next 5 years? And on biofuels, you didn't talk about algae and so on. Is that scalable or not?
Yeah, so on the pricing outlook for us is this. I'll give you a couple of sets of numbers that I think will put it all in perspective. We look at the midterm, I'd call it, so the next 10 years or so on gas, and we say it's likely in that $4 to $6 or even $4 to $7 per thousand standard cubic feet kind of level. So that's a pretty moderate price of gas, and that's all based on the assumptions I mentioned before in terms of this supply and demand. So as an energy user, that's pretty good news. As an energy producer, these are relatively thin margins, and you watch your business very closely, and using technology to lower the cost is going to be critical to that. I think the full piece of that story then is we look across all these resources in North America that we're developing. They're not all created equal. Some are higher cost than others. They might be deeper. They might produce at lower levels. So we have, from a profitability standpoint, I mean, when I give you a break-even number, that means I start to make a profit at that number. That ranges from $3 an MCF to $5. So some of those, at a $4 price of gas, there's some resources we're developing very quickly, and some we basically stop or slow down on. And as the price, finds its point over time, more of those will come into viability. On the biofuel side, we've chosen the sugarcane biofuel because of all the attributes I mentioned before, but also because it's commercial today. And we're doing all kinds of research on biofuels. And we've been in algae, we've been in enzymes that will take biomass and turn them directly into a gasoline and skip the ethanol phase. And I mean, there's some fascinating R&D. The problem with that R&D we're finding is the world would like to see some of this now, and we and I don't think anybody is actually getting out of this trap of how long it takes to develop these new technologies. So I'll give you an example based on real energy development over time, over history. You have to get to the point of demonstrating a new technology at a commercial scale before it's viable. And then you need, and listen to these numbers, they're startling, but it's the scale of the energy system. You need double-digit growth in that new technology after you have a commercial plant to develop the industrial capacity you need, and you need that double-digit growth for 30 years to get to be between 1% and 2% of the energy system. I mean, so we're talking about phenomenal growth is required. And we look at this research, whether it's algae or some of the other biofuel areas, and we say that's just too slow. So we went into an existing viable biofuel, and we actually have now contributed our R&D companies to that existing, now $12 billion joint venture. And we're saying, don't just keep doing and growing what you're doing, but take this technology, try to use it on this existing commercial scale activity and speed up the whole process.
Listen, we have run out of time. So I want to thank Marvin and for a great session. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thanks, Joe.
Terrific.